Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and thank you to the organizer for having me. My name is Philip Mai. I'm the co-director of the Social Media Lab in Toronto Metropolitan University. I'm here today to present a case study that we at the lab did last year looking at how, specifically Twitter, how the conversation about Ukrainian refugees are occurring, what people are saying about Ukrainian refugees, and what kind of frames people are using to discuss and to discredit or to support Ukrainian refugees. As part of our lab, what we do is we take empirical data, so it's not just hearsay. We look at the digital exhaust or digital footprint that people leave behind online to see how they say and how they express themselves on these topics. We're new to the Ukrainian studies community, so I want to take this opportunity to also just introduce ourselves to you and also to introduce some of the tools that we've developed at the lab that might be of interest to some of the researchers that are in the room and some of the students in the room who are looking for data to examine things that they are interested in. I hope you will indulge me and let me introduce ourselves a little bit before I get into the case study. So again, our lab started about 15 years ago. We have grown with social media. We started in 2010 at Dalhousie University, and then a few years later, we moved the entire lab to Toronto Metropolitan University. And as you can see, our research interest has basically matched and mirrored many of the things that we are now concerned about and worry about with social media. At the beginning, we were looking at things like, how does academic use of social media? But those are the early days when things were a little bit more innocent. By 2013, 2014, we got into things like, misinformation, looking at politics and how people are using social media to get an advantage or an edge on their competition. We kept on adding research areas simply because social media became woven into all aspects of our lives. Anatoly and I, when we first started the lab in 2010, when we were asked to be interviewed for something, the stories that usually appears, that we would appear in, would be in the last 3 to 5 minutes. The fluffy puppy stories at the end of the newscast. Now, when we are being asked to go on and talk about anything related to social media, we're in the first 5 minutes of the show, because it shows how social media at the beginning was considered to be a fad, has now become basically front and center because that's where the eyeballs are. People go to where the people are, and they're online now. We have made a decision when we first started the lab to never accept money from any of the platform that we study. We work very hard to get fundings from everybody else except, so they come to offer in the past. Anatoly and I always joke that our main job is basically figure out how to keep the light on. That and doing research. And as an academic research lab, we do what you expect of an academic research lab. Conference presentation like this, journal articles, book chapters, posters, and so on. Some of our recent publication in the last few years since the invasion, we started pivoting and putting our lenses and our data knowledge onto looking and examining the effect of the war, but specifically on Canadians. So we, for example, surveyed 1,500 Canadians and asked them, hey, have you seen any of these common narratives that are being pushed by Russia? Because we're trying to provide our policymakers with information about the kind of lies that have legs in this country. So this way, if they have limited resources, these are the, let's say, top 3 narratives that tend to be believed by Canadians. Then the policymakers can then use that information to decide, how do we counter that? Because they might not have money and resources to counter, let's say, all 10, 15 of the most common, but they will have some resources to counter some of the more pernicious type of information. So that was the idea behind the study on the factors that contribute to pro-Kremlin disinformation. We also started looking in things like, hey, there's things like soft moderation, like blur screens and little footnote. Because for a long time, one of the ways that a social media company can go to Parliament and go to Congress and says, hey, look, we're doing something. We're putting little footnotes at the bottom, right? We won't take the post away, but look, we're doing something. We're paying fact checkers to provide the fact check. And look, we're providing the footnotes. And we want to know, does the footnote help? Does it reduce the number of spread or sharing? And yes, it does. So if you're interested in any of those studies, the UR code is there. But if you like the slides, talk to me at Anatoly afterward, and we'll have to provide you with the slides. The other thing that we've been doing is that we realized when we first started out, it takes 1.5 years to 2 years for some of our publications to ever see daylight. And by that time, nobody cares. So by 2017, we realized we have to start pushing and publishing public reports which we can then spend a year or two later doing academic journals articles on them. But in the meantime, at least the content of what we're working on is already out and part of the discussion. So our reports have been showing up in parliamentary meetings, reports of the government, and the only reason we know that is when a reporter calls and says, hi, I just did a Freedom of Information request, and your lab name was mentioned in this report. Can you send us a copy? That's how we know that the stuff that we're doing is having impact, because people are quoting it and citing it. Our research has been featured variously in all over the country because of the types of research that we do. So next, I'm going to do a quick overview of some of the tools that might be of interest to some of the students and researchers that are in the room. Because one of the complaints a lot of people have is, I have interesting question I want to ask, but I don't know how to get that data, and I don't have the time to get another PhD in computer science, or I don't have the resources to have a full-time IT person on staff who helped me develop a script and capture that data and give me a CSV. And when we decided a few years ago, probably if anybody's going to provide that service in Canada, it's probably going to be us. So that's why we started developing software to make it available to the academic community. If you know how to use a search bar, you know how to use our tools. Some of the tools that we developed, one of which is called Communalytic, which I'm going to go into a bit details in a second. That allows you to capture all kind of data from social media to use for your study. And then we develop a lot of dashboards to track things like deepfakes. So every time an incident that involves deepfakes that appears in the world, it will show up in our dashboard. So if you are an analyst working for the government, if you're an analyst or a researcher working in academia, the latest example of, let's say, deepfakes appearing somewhere in the world, you can just go and see, hey, today, did anybody fact check anything involving deepfakes? It'll be there because we basically done that job for you. Same thing with the conflict misinfo dashboard, which I'm going to go into detail in a little bit. And the Poly Dashboard. Poly Dashboard is an app that tracks every single political advertisement in Canada, in the US, and 30 other countries. So for example, if you want to know what the Liberal Party did this week, this month, this year on Facebook, you can go to our app and you can see it, say, hey, show me who they are targeting this week. Which province are they spending all of their money? Are they going after eyeballs that belongs to 18 to 24-year-olds in Quebec? Are they going after women 65 plus in Nova Scotia? You will know that by looking at our dashboard. So getting to a little bit about Communalytic, that you get all kind of data from social media, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Reddit, Telegram. So there was a lot of talk and discussion about Telegram yesterday, simply because that's a place where a lot of Ukrainians get their news. So we've been also doing a lot of work looking at Telegram and how that is being used by the people on that platform, and also who actually have a voice on that platform and who has influence, and who are the main characters on that. So we've been tracking all of that, and we're going to be putting out more reports on that so that others can figure out, okay, these are the accounts we need to pay attention to, because these are the one that has outside influence in the conversation and the narrative about Ukraine. Along with being able to collect data, once you have the data, we can then help you to analyze it. So you can do, there's 4 different modules in there. There's a civility module that basically, hi, here's a data set of 1 million Telegram posts. Show me only posts that contains toxic messages. I don't want to see anything else. Out of the 1 million, show me, let's say, the 10,000 or whatever that might contain toxic messages. And recently, we gave you the ability to also find pro-social messages. So for example, only show me messages that include pro-social behavior. You can also do sentiment analysis. There's a topic analyzer in there and a network analyzer. So getting to the conflict misinfo, which I think will be interesting to a lot of the people here, which speaks to a lot of the work that the International Fact Checker Group does. Right now, if you want to know if there's a recent fact check that involves the Russo-Ukrainian War, you'll have to go to, let's say, AFP or any of the other groups, Stuffik, right? What we did was we built a dashboard, so every morning you can just load up this dashboard, bookmark it, and you can get the latest fact check that involves this. Because many fact-checking groups, they do fact-checking on a wide variety of topics in their country and in their region. But we're not interested in everything that they do. We only want to bring in anything and everything that involves the Russian-Ukraine war. Why? The reason, because we believe that a lot of these narratives are being shopped around, meaning they will try something in Africa 3 months earlier, and they will see if it works. If it works there, They will try to do a version of it. We saw that evidence when we were doing research on COVID misinformation during 2020. We noticed that bad actors were literally using Latin America and Africa as testing grounds. So many of the things that we would say, like, wait, we saw that 3 months ago. And then now somebody in the US have taken a version of that lie, but they put a spin on it to make it feel more local 3 months later. So we use this as an early detection tool where we say, okay, let's see what's floating around. And then we keep an eye on to see which of those narratives pops up again in a different part of the world. Because these bad actors, they might not meet in a room, but they're watching each other. They're learning from each other. We need to learn from each other also. Because they see what's working in the US, and then it shows up in Brazil. We saw a lot of that pattern. The pattern was very interesting. A lot of stuff that's happening in the US end up in Brazil. And one of the reasons why is in Brazil, there is a huge network of churches that were started in the 80s by American churches. So they have a connection there. So as a result, there's a constant communication between religious groups in the US that are more right-leaning to the group in Brazil. So as a result, they share notes. So we saw that pattern there. So one of the things on the conflict research portal is the dashboard that I mentioned earlier. You can literally go there and just see fact checks from over 200 plus fact checkers. And then if you see anything that is interesting to you, you click it. We take you directly to the fact checkers so that you can get more detail about that. For example, recently when the US shut down US aid, there was a lie going around that says that US aid was using their money to pay for stars to go to Ukraine and so on. And it was wasting taxpayer dollars. But that was quickly fact-checked right away. But again, if you are looking for examples for your next presentation, this is a good place to start because it's one of the few places where you can get basically a bird's eye view of the entire landscape of lies against Ukraine in one place. So this way you can be up to date and help to refute them as they come up. Now we'll finally get to the part that we promised, which is the study that we did last year. The paper is called Digital Battleground, Examination of Anti-Refugee Discourse on Twitter Against Ukrainians and Display by Russian Invasion of Ukraine. I don't have to tell the people in this room about what happened after the war started. A lot of people left simply because there was a lot of fear. I have family in Ukraine, and they were on the borders going to Poland in the days right after. We had to quickly set up, change our homes and get ready to receive them. So I know the experience well. And as a former refugee myself, I came from Vietnam originally. My family came to the US 40 plus years ago as refugees. So many of the experience that my relatives in Ukraine experience today is reminiscent of my own 40 years ago, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this study in particular. One of the reasons is there's a lot of polarization against refugees right now around the world. You can see that in the politics in the US with the border walls. You can see that changing here in Canada. We used to be a very pro-immigration country, but you can also see the narrative being changed here in Canada already in the last few years. But that didn't happen by accident. There's a lot of reason behind it. But one of the reasons is that state actors have realized that this is a powerful tool and a weapon that they can use. State actors like Russia have used immigration as a weapon against the West, against Europe in the past, and they know that it's very effective. It gives ammunition to right-wing groups in their country because every time they send more people over, for example, through a particular crossing in Finland, it's going to create problems for the Finnish government. We saw that here in Canada a year and a half, 2 years ago when we have a lot of Haitian refugees coming to Quebec. So the research question that we want to ask is, what are some of the most prevalent types of anti-refugee discourse on X? We were able to get data from X before Elon came along and shut everything down. So most of this data came from that period right before Elon came on because we knew he was going to shut it down. So Anatole and I started capturing tons and tons of data on this topic so that we could do this study. So what we did is we captured over 800,000 tweets between February 24th and March 31st. We basically searched for any tweet that contained the word Ukraine in various languages. So this way, because we want to be as comprehensive as possible. So once we have that data set, what we did was we then used machine learning to quickly look through the 800,000. Hey, because we have a hunch that most of the anti-Ukrainian stuff is going to be toxic. So we didn't want to look and spend time reading all of the other 800-something thousand tweets. We just wanted to find out the ones that are toxic, because we strongly believe that that's probably one of the vectors which is going to be, or a signifier that's used to pass on some Russian narratives and Russian propaganda. And then once we did that, we then developed a coding schema to basically label the toxic tweets to find out, like, what are they saying? How are they framing? How are they talking about Ukrainian refugees? How are they undermining them? To get a little bit into how we did that. So the machine learning system that we use is something developed by Google called Perspective. We incorporate it into the tool that we develop at the lab called Communalytic. As I mentioned earlier, it can detect pro-social interactions, or it can detect toxic interaction. For this research report, we only use the toxic measures. We look for things like toxicity, severe toxicity, insult, identity attack, profanity, threats. As you can see from the definition, toxicity is stuff that are rude and disrespectful. Severe toxicity is stuff that's very hateful, aggressive, disrespectful. And like I said, in the old days, when we first started doing this kind of research over a decade ago, we would literally give some of our student lab members 10,000 tweets as a sample and says, hi, on a scale of 1 to 10, how toxic is this? 10 years later, we're able to do this now using machine learning. So this way, we can use our research assistant for more valuable things instead of having to read 10,000 tweets and code them. But what does the score mean? If a post have a score of, let's say, 0.7, it means that if you were to show that same post to 7 out of 10 to 10 people, 7 out of 10 will probably say, yeah, that's toxic. Okay, so this has been tested many times, and we validated Google's work. Before we try to use this tool as a part of our study, we do internal study to validate that it's accurate. Otherwise, we wouldn't put our name behind the tool. Now you know a little bit about how we detected the toxic messages among all the posts that we captured. So here's some examples, some of the claims. Things like they're dangerous, they're criminal. So there's one that says Ukraine refugees kill sleeping man with axe and rapes women. The claims about refugees abusing the system. Hey, look, they're in Germany, but every month she goes home to visit her family. So is she really a refugee? So they want to plant the seed of doubt. So this way, the local population will not support helping Ukrainian. This is what I call very insidious little comments that when you have enough of them and you do it repeatedly, it becomes part of people's belief system, right? So, like I said, with this project, we want to document, like, what are those things that they are saying? We used 3 different human coders to code those tweets after we identified them. But before we did that, what we did was we went through the literature and we identified all of the frames that have been used to discuss and talk about refugees, right? And then we use those frames to map them to the narratives that were in our data. Because regular people, when they speak about refugees, they're not going to say things like administrative costs, right? They're not going to say things like security. Well, they might, but not in that way. So we want to map some of those things that are in the literature to our first set of codes, right? And then we gave the initial code to the 3 coders, and then independently they had to go through and look at all of the tweets and then put them into these buckets. And then over time, we realized that some of the initial buckets that we developed earlier, the 5, some of the tweets didn't fit into some of those buckets. So we had to get more buckets. So as you can see, the list became longer. Right? Because some of the tweets were like more politically, most of the tweets we found were politically motivated partisan content. There was a lot of expression of countering. That's very critical to point out. Countering is when other people come on and say, well, that's not true, what you're saying. It's a lesson to not to ignore things when you see them online. It's important to counter them because it helps to lessen the impact of that narrative. It's basically taking a bucket of cold water and putting on the fire that they're trying to start. But we saw a lot of that. That was the second most frequent thing that we saw in the data when we started the coding. So here's the result. What we found is that among the toxic posts, 53 of them were basically expressing very pro-Kremlin narratives. That 53% is made up of, 33% are politically motivated partisan content aligning with pro-Kremlin narratives, discrediting Western institutions like NATO. 2% were attempt at discrediting, Western media in general. 12% was narratives characterizing Ukrainian refugees as parasitic to the host country because they wanted to dehumanize Ukrainians as not deserving of help. So this way, it's easier for the member of parliament to say, my people don't want this, right? And look, there's evidence of it. The other one was 6% was undermining the Ukrainian government. They were discrediting, the government institutions and the government itself as being illegitimate, or they were pushing the pro-Nazi narrative and Ukrainian being racist a lot in the early days, we noticed, because they want to push the idea that Ukraine do not help because they are Nazi. So as a result, they should be your enemy, which is a lie. But that was something they were pushing in the early days. You don't hear that as much anymore. They move on to other things. But in the early days, that was one of the things they were pushing on. So in conclusion, our study was trying to contribute to the growing body of literature documenting the trends in polarization of refugees and partisan state actors. And it highlights the need for a more nuanced approach to reviewing toxic posts and targeting refugees, because as you can see, 20%, if you only rely on computational methods, you might miss the fact that, hey, sometimes people use bad words to defend people. By having both computational and a manual approach, you were able to tease out the actual conversation. Where are people just being nasty, and where are people countering that? For future research, we want to look at the visual content. As you know, TikTok is very popular. Lots of things are in videos. There's no little notes at the bottom. You have to see the video to understand the context or what the message they're trying to say. In the future, we're going to look into how people are using visual content to push these kind of narratives. For some closing thoughts, the West immigration policy is going to be exploited. There's no question there. Countries like Russia, China, and Iran will exploit that. And probably the next time I present this, sadly, I'll probably have to add the US flag to that. We have an election coming up here in Canada. One of the concerns that we have at the lab is whether the US will activate and change their refugee laws in the US that will cause a panic and cause a lot of people who are currently in the US to come up here during our election. We have an election coming up. So that's a way to interfere in our election without directly interfering in our election. They simply change their policy, and people being people that will make a decision about their lives, their family, the likely place they're going to run to is here. That will create a problem for us right in the middle of an election. So that's one of the things that at the lab we've been keeping an eye on, just to see whether there's sign of that happening and whether our government is ready to respond to that, because that is a lever that a foreign government can use to put the thumb on the scale to help the population vote in a way that's more preferable to them. So anyway, in closing, that's my presentation. Thank you.